Okay, so hi APES students. I am basically doing a short video to cover some material that we're not going to get to in class for Chapter 3. So we talked in class about biogeochemical cycles, and this kind of bridges from that. So with biogeochemical cycles, you have different elements cycling in nature, in the abiotic and biotic components of our ecosystem. And basically from that, in terms of what scientists can understand about our ecosystem, it's very hard to study an ecosystem at large scales, as we talked about. So in order to kind of understand the cycling of different cycles, whether it's the nitrogen cycle or the phosphorus cycle, scientists often undertake what are called watershed studies. And again, because it's difficult to study at a global scale, it's easier to do this at a smaller scale. And a watershed is a really good area to do this type of study for cycles, different biological cycles, because it's basically an area of land where all the water draining through that land goes to the same place. So you can see from this picture here that this side of the valley and this side of the valley and then this side of these mountains here are all part of the same watershed, because the water that falls on these parts of on this land all goes to the same water source, the river here. And even though they have little streams, all these streams meet up in this river. This area here and this area here are considered part of another watershed, because the water falls this way into another stream. Okay, so a watershed is kind of a contained area, or it's not a contained area, but it's an area that you can really draw a line around depending on which way the water flows. Okay, so all this water in here is really going to be collected from this entire area, and you can really understand and learn something about what's going on in this area by looking at the water in it. So it's pretty neat. Okay, so one of the first and most influential experiments to study this phenomenon is called the Hubbard-Brooke experiment. And in 1962, up in New Hampshire, scientists did a very large controlled experiment to test the different basically the different cycles, and to see what the influence of forest had on the different biological cycles in that watershed. So they studied the effects of the clear cutting, and so here's a clear cut watershed here, and there's the control that wasn't clear cut. So within 6 months after the cutting, the clear cut watershed had significantly more nitrogen in the stream. Okay, so basically this area, the watershed where there were no trees, the stream had a lot more nitrogen. Okay, so why might that be? Well, they determined that without the trees are essentially holding the soil together. They're taking up nitrogen from the soil. So without the trees, all the soil is running into the water nearby. So we really gained a very good understanding of the role of forests and also the cycling of nitrogen, and kind of from that the other nutrients in our ecosystem. And we see that forests basically allow the terrestrial landscape to accumulate nutrients and basically take them up into their plant tissues, which can then be transferred to animals when they eat them. Otherwise, if the forests weren't there and the plant life wasn't there, the nitrogen and other elements would essentially go through the soil without being captured by anything, and go into the river and eventually end up in the ocean. So we see really the importance of terrestrial vegetation, which we will talk a lot about the rest of the year. Okay, and so this is just a blow up of the picture. You can see what a drastic, large-scale experiment this really was, and it was really the first of its kind to be at this large scale. And I've heard about this experiment a lot, kind of in my studies of this field, and it's still talked about. You can see this in your textbook too. Okay, so in terms of how, especially with a disturbance like this, your book goes into kind of the discussion of what disturbances are and how ecosystems can respond to it. So basically a disturbance, as you might expect, is just an event that is going to cause some sort of change in a community, okay, whether it's the population or the composition of the community itself, and it can be caused by various different things, whether it's physically being cut down or introducing some sort of chemical or toxin, or even introducing an invasive species. So that would be the biological component there. And ecosystems respond to disturbance and deal with disturbance in different ways, of course. One term with regard to how they can respond to disturbances is called resistance. Okay, so that's the ability of an ecosystem to withstand a disturbance and maintain normal function. And I have this picture here to kind of demonstrate resistance, because this man is, resisting the pressure of, this whatever that is, this box. Okay, so he's not falling down. He's pushing back, and he's kind of resisting the forces of that. And so that's what an ecosystem would do under a disturbance. They would maintain normal function. He's still standing upright, although he's kind of leaning over, but he's trying to maintain normal function without letting it really, damage him. Resilience is the ability for an ecosystem to recover, okay? So I have grass here because I just always think of grass when, with regard to the term resilience, because imagine you step on grass. I mean, grass is stepped on all the time, and it's so resilient. It flattens out, and then it comes right back up. So grass is very, very resilient. It's not resistant at all. Like it doesn't hold, it doesn't hold against any kind of pressure, but it's so resilient that it doesn't really matter. It comes right back. And these two kind of terms are important when scientists look into restoration ecology, which is basically a subfield of ecology where scientists go in and try to restore damaged ecosystems, and they look for what species are resilient and which species are resistant. So it's just a new discipline that you should be aware of. And this idea of the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, so if you look at this graph, you have the amount of disturbance, and this is the number of species in a certain ecosystem, so it's dependent on the amount of disturbance there is. Okay, so this is a really kind of interesting theory that ecosystems that have intermediate levels of disturbance, so not, this is hardly any disturbance at all, and then this is a lot of disturbance. They're actually most diverse when there's this intermediate level of disturbance, okay? So you might think, oh, well, it would probably be best to have no disturbance, but it turns out if you're looking at species richness, the number of species, it's at that intermediate level where you have the most. So why do you think that is? Well, if you have a frequent amount of disturbance, so it's just happening all the time, there's hardly any time for any species to really establish themselves, and you're pretty much going to get, if you are disturbing an area a lot, you're pretty much going to get the most fast-growing species. If you're cutting down an area, you get those species that are going to grow in really, that are able to grow in high amounts of sunlight. So you never get kind of more secondary and species that are kind of canopy trees and that sort of thing that need shade. So you're only going to get a certain amount of really kind of quick growing and pretty resilient species here. If you're here and you hardly ever disturb it, you're not going to have very much change in the ecosystem over time, and so this most dominant species are really going, or the most, the best competitors are really going to dominate the ecosystem and not allow for other species to establish themselves. So if you think of a forest that hasn't been damaged, and this is natural damage also, there's not going to be as many species as a forest that, whether it's a small fire or like in the rainforest, there were some what's called tree falls all the time. So trees fell on their own all the time, and this basically created a light gap, and that was a brand new place for new species to colonize in that little hole of light in the canopy. And we'll talk more about this, but it is an interesting phenomena that areas that are that are disturbed kind of intermediate levels have more species. That's not to say necessarily it's good or bad, but that's just what people have found. Okay, so on the last day before our test, we're going to talk about ecosystem services, and this is briefly to introduce it to you. So this idea of ecosystem service is basically what has the ecosystem provided for us, and what does it provide for us. And you know, it's actually very hard to kind of quantify these things because you know, we kind of take most of it for granted. But if you think of things like pollination, you know, all the fruit that we eat, you know, people usually don't go out and hand pollinate these things. The bees do that, different bird species do that. And same with water purification, that happens naturally. And, you know, storage of carbon, so many different things that we're going to talk about more in class. And there was a very interesting study done in 1997 in the magazine, science magazine called Science, which is a very prominent journal. And these scientists actually went ahead and tried to quantify, in terms of, you know, on a monetary scale, the value of ecosystem services to us. And you know, what is the value of soil? I mean, how do you even try to quantify that? If you think about it, you know, we don't create soil. It is formed naturally. And so just kind of looking at all these different services, whether it's flood protection, you know, food, maintaining oxygen in our atmosphere, all these things that happen naturally are obviously very valuable. And they came to a value, and this is again in 1997, of $33 trillion. So it's quite a lot. So you can kind of see what the different services are here. And your book actually distinguishes the ecosystem services, and categorizes them into different types. So provisions are goods that humans can use directly. So that would be, you know, whether it's timber or food, but things that we actually consume that nature produces for us. Regulating services are basically anything that the environment does to regulate its own conditions. So examples of this would be whether it's climate control, maintaining, you know, the right gases in our atmosphere, temperature, that sort of thing. And support systems, as it says here, they provide kind of services. They don't necessarily regulate environmental conditions, but they provide services that we depend on, like pollination, filters, like, you know, filtering water, pest control. Other examples might, you know, be like soil formation, that sort of thing. And then resilience is just, you know, it's very valuable if the ecosystem is resilient, because, you know, that's gonna basically allow it to then provide these other functions. And lastly are cultural services. So the value, you know, we value ecosystems beyond this, just for, you know, imagine being in an area that was all concrete, no trees, no grass, no flowers, nothing. You know, we do have kind of an intrinsic, and I think, you know, it's deeply embedded in our DNA that we, you know, when we're in the middle of a beautiful, you know, landscape, or on the beach looking at the ocean, that kind of affects us in some way that it's hard to describe. And so that's kind of whether it's the aesthetic components, or just, you know, enjoying fishing or hiking or swimming in the ocean. So those are things we obviously value as well. And that is it. All right, thanks for watching. I will see you in class.